The cancerous culture of entitlement inside our wannabe elites. This past week, the Biden administration announced that through executive order, they would be seeking to establish student loan forgiveness to the tune of $10,000 for anyone under a certain income threshold. That student loan, quote unquote, forgiveness could go as high as $20,000 depending on the status of Pell Grants. It's a fascinating bit of wordplay and government handout all in one. Joe Biden can no better forgive debt than Joe Biden can forgive sin. He can simply transfer the burden of debt to someone else. He can simply make someone else pay for your bills. In this case, he's looking to shift the debt of college graduates, young professionals, wannabe elites from that socioeconomic class to the taxpayer, to the blue-collar taxpayer, the non-college educated taxpayer, to the ultimate rube in a society and culture of entitlement, the rube who handles his responsibilities, shifting that bill to the rube who already paid off his own student debt. This is absolutely unforgivable as a government policy. It's absolutely a transfer of wealth, and it's absolutely cancerous to our culture in moving us towards a culture of wannabe elites and their entitlement. Let me explain. When I talked about this on social media this past week, I had somebody come back to me and say, oh, it'll be fascinating to see what Will Cain chooses to do. Will he pay off his son's college debt, or will he require them to shoulder that debt? Or maybe, in the words of this social media responder, quote, he'll simply just make them go to trade school. One statement, so much revealed. It is my belief, as we've talked about in the past couple of episodes of the Will Cain podcast, and in particular in a conversation with Professor Gad Saad, that elitism is the ultimate dividing line in society. It is the decision matrix for most individuals. It's most people's North Star, how they decide what they will buy, what they will do, who they will associate, where they go to school, what kind of job they pursue. Will they be elite? We're a society of wannabe elites. And I'm not just talking about money, by the way. This instinct, this desire to find someone that you're better than is actually larger than who maintains a high income. Think about this. I grew up in a small town in Texas. Many of you listening probably grew up in small towns across this great land. There is a particular type of person, and I will say that more often than not, this type of person finds themselves on the left side of the political spectrum. And this person believes that by their education and their self-described intellect, they are better than the conservative community, the conservative neighbors with whom they grew up. This isn't actually elitism, a quality that is monopolized by either end of the political spectrum. You can see this instinct to find someone that you're better than anywhere you look in society. Look, on the right side of the political spectrum, you'll see people who lord their wealth over others. Left and right like to lord their social status over others. Who got invited to the party, who did not, and who drives the nicer vehicle, who goes to the fancier private school, who has the higher education, who has the more esteemed job. It's not simply a matter of pride and accomplishment. It's a matter of being better than your neighbor. You can even find it, for that matter, on the right side of the political spectrum most often in the practice of religion. Look, you and I both know that. There are people who are literally, quote unquote, holier than thou. Did you sit in a pew close enough up to the front? Are you living according to the commandments? And that's not, again, always maintained as a personal accomplishment or a personal ideal. It is, sadly, far too often, as an accomplishment of status over thy neighbor. I do think it is a base human instinct. I had a law professor once say that a simple, immutable law is that the rich do not want to live next to the poor. Look at the decisions that are made in schooling and in buying homes, and you will find that that is the one common consistency in humanity, that the rich move away from the poor, regardless of race, regardless of culture. The rich move away from the poor. Someone again said to me on social media, "Oh yeah, Will, where do you live?" Nobody wants to live next to the poor. Here's what I would say to you. I don't care where you choose to live. I don't care the size of your house. What I'm talking about and what I care is whether or not you think that neighborhood or that home makes you better than the poor. It is the instinct to always have someone that you can find to make you feel better about yourself. And the funny thing is, if you look at it in the end, those who consider themselves elite, either by educational standard or wealth, really aren't in the grand scheme of things. In a big, broad context, they're not elite. And the minute they move to Manhattan, they find that out. Not as smart, not as educated, not as high of a degree, not as wealthy, not as rich, not as moral as I once thought. And all of that applies to me. I mean it. This isn't simply Will Cain sitting on the Temple Mount, living a life of pure virtue. It is all of us, not as smart, not as good looking, not as moral, not as rich as we might imagine. And even those that truly are elite, the truly educated or the truly wealthy, they're not as rich, as moral, as good looking as they might imagine. They're not truly elite because most of the markers of elitism are fraudulent. The education is fraudulent. You want to ask me if I will just, quote unquote, send my sons to trade school? I will be immeasurably proud if my sons go choose to be a welder. I will be full, a heart bursting with pride if my sons deal with their own debt and handle their own responsibilities in this life, not look for a handout from Joe Biden. Almost all of elitism is about personal insecurity, and almost all of elitism is fraudulent. As is this program to forgive student debt. It is absolutely fraudulent. Here's what I mean. It's going to make the cost of education rise, and not just rise simply, but rise with hyperinflation. Look, here's a quick history of hyperinflation and education. In the 1970s, the government established Sallie Mae, a quasi-public-private institution, to make it easier for banks to underwrite and the government to back student loans. All of a sudden, the population of students available and who could afford, on the surface, college exploded. What happened? Of course, the cost of college immediately went up. And with that, by the way, default on student loans began to rise, so much that in the past, then Senator Joe Biden talked about expanding the rules under Sallie Mae and the government's backed educational loans to make it harder for a student to default on his education loans. But not today. Not today. Now we look for an extra $10,000 in handouts in student loan forgiveness. Forgive me. Transfer in debt to the taxpayer. What did that do? It meant that education costs exceeded the rate of inflation by 4.6. Hyperinflation. Education rose at a rate 4.5 times greater than the rest of the economy's inflation. Let's give specifics. In 1971, in order to attend a private university in the United States of America, the average cost of tuition was $2,930. By 2021, the cost to go to that same private institution would have been $51,690. From just shy of $3,000 a year to $52,000 a year. I told you a few weeks ago that on vacation, I have a kid who's just begun his freshman year of high school. I began to look, what's it cost to go to TCU? $75,000. What's it cost to go to Harvard? $80,000. $80,000 a year, which includes room and board, But if you take great relief from that asterisk, you have more money than almost everyone else. $75,000, $80,000, $70,000 for the Baylors, the Pepperdines, the SMUs. Oh, you want to go to a state school? Great, much cheaper. Texas Tech, $25,000 a year. The University of Kansas, $30,000 a year. These are the prices of getting the highest education in America. An education, by the way, who not only is devoid of morality, but devoid of knowledge increasingly, in my estimation, in 2022. Oh, sure, I can spend $75,000 a year for my son or daughter to go learn exactly about gender identity, about critical race, queer, trans theory, to see the entire world through the prism of diversity and neo-racism, to think that the most important thing in this world is to look at the cultural and social dynamics, not the engineering and mathematics and entrepreneurship that drive the world. But we're going to give $10,000 in student loan debt forgiveness. What do you think will happen? Well, the same thing that's happened to any industry that you have subsidized. Any industry the government chooses to subsidize. And let's stop using the word subsidize, because it doesn't truly tell the story of what the government does when it interrupts a market. When you have a third party step in and pay the bills, all of a sudden the consumer and the seller no longer care about the price. Look, if you and I went to a pawn shop, you operated the pawn shop and I was the buyer. But it wasn't my money I was going to spend to buy it, and it wasn't my money you were going to collect to sell it, but rather an anonymous third party who isn't even in the building with us at the time of purchase. Neither of us cares. You can jack the price as high as you want, and I will offload the cost on the third party. Any market that the third party interferes with, cost will rise. Any transaction where the consumer and seller do not care about the price will rise. The housing market, subsidized by the government, inflated to a bubble in 2009 that ultimately burst and sent our economy into a recession. Remember the Community Reinvestment Act? Remember subprime mortgages? Remember that everyone in the famous movie The Big Short, including your local stripper, owned 2 to 3 homes? And by the way, has not looked unlike the last couple of years, until now interest rates are rising up to 5%. In many places today. From education, housing to healthcare. The most famous example of hyperinflation, with a third party footing the bill. Look, you've had your jaw drop when you've seen the prices, but don't worry about it. You're not worried about it. You just got to pay your premium and your deductible, right? The insurance company pays the rest. And of course, they don't pay that, by the way. They negotiate it down. Anyone who's ever paid cash for anything at a doctor's office knows the true price. If you're willing to pay cash, the doctor will give you a somewhat real market price for whatever it is that you need. Hair plugs or an appendicitis. Have your appendix removed. Healthcare, education, housing, any market the government has decided to subsidize, where the government has come to help, has proven the words of Ronald Reagan prophetic. That the 10 most scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And who are we helping? As we mentioned, at least in no small part, the institutions. They're going to rise prices. So who are we talking about? We're talking about institutions that received $76 billion in COVID funds over the last several years. Higher education, the university system, received $76 billion in COVID funds. And by the way, the top 10 universities in this country already maintained a $200 billion endowment. I mean, you can break that down into individual institutions like Yale, a $42 billion endowment. Harvard, a $53 billion endowment. Not for nothing, but Harvard's endowment just went to number 2, behind the University of Texas, whose endowment has exceeded Harvard's $53 billion. Want to know why? Because Harvard, of course, had to now begin to invest according to woke ideology, ESG, right? Environmental, social, and governance standards, which meant divesting themselves of oil and gas revenues. That's no problem for the University of Texas, who is making money hand over fist. in oil and gas, and now their endowment worth more than Harvard. But I feel sorry for none of them, and neither should you. Massive endowments, massive funds in COVID relief, and we're about to give them another massive subsidy and another excuse to raise prices so they can build a third water slide at the fourth pool in Lubbock, just off of Tech Terrace. We're literally paying for lazy rivers. Take a look at a college campus today. Go to the University of Minnesota. Go to Texas A&M. Go to Clemson. They are Club Med. Actually, Club Med has nothing. Club Med has nothing on Kansas State. So who are we really taking care of? We're taking care of this university. We're taking care of these wannabe elites. And ultimately, we're also taking care of course, the Democratic Party. Just like with the expansion of the IRS, a new 87,000 agents for the IRS, whose public union represents 90% of those workers. And that public union contributes 90% of its political donations to the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party, in turn, funds the doubling of the size of the IRS's public union, thus, in turn, doubling their fundraising to the Democratic Party. This student loan forgiveness raises money for the Democratic Party. Higher education, of course, skews horrifically, wonderfully left. In higher education, employees donate almost exclusively to the Democratic Party. In the last election cycle, $300 million to the Democratic Party. And now they have yet another government subsidy to raise their prices without touching their incredible endowments. Ultimately, the Democratic Party is selling out the American taxpayer. Ultimately, Joe Biden is selling out the responsible, productive individual out there who paid off their own student loan. Ultimately, they're selling out the blue collar, the working man, the productive, the responsible. And ultimately, they're retreating to the core constituency of their party, which is the college-educated, mostly wannabe, and some actual elites. And those wannabe and actual elites, all fraudulent, are creating and benefiting from our new culture, cancerous culture, of entitlement. Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.